Alrighty, it appears that I am live. And there is my video. Excellent. Amanda, hi. Totally famous. Beverly, Joan, hi. Excellent. See and hear me. That's a plus. Excellent. Natalia, hi. Oh, I'm seeing some familiar names here. That's really awesome. I think I'm going to be seeing a lot of familiar names actually. Good evening. Good morning from Australia. So it's 9 a.m. here. I did have my coffee about 2 hours ago though, so maybe I should have had a top up. Hello from Wollongong, New South Wales. Hi Sue. California, USA, New Jersey. Awesome. I love that this pet photography community is everyone all over the world. It's so great. It gets a little bit confusing with time zones and seasons sometimes, but we can work through that. Awesome. So Nicole asked me to do this training at the start of this week. It was kind of a little bit of a last minute thing. So I've been working hard to put this together for you all because I know that shooting manual is something that a lot of people do struggle with, and I can definitely understand why, because it really is quite confusing. Photography is a fairly old, old in terms of, I guess civilization, but it's old in terms of the type of technology, I suppose, that it employs. So things like aperture and shutter speed and ISO, they all have their roots in different things, and so there's the numbers to designate the values of those things are all a little bit strange and different. So I don't know any other thing where you sort of go from f1.4 to f2.8 and then up to f5.6. Like, what are those numbers? It's really, really confusing. Shutter speed makes a little bit more sense, and ISO kind of makes a little bit of sense, but I think aperture is the big one that people really struggle with. Okay. Oh, we've got lots of people joining. That's awesome. Bayside Brisbane. Oh, a fellow Brisbaneite. Awesome. Another one from Wollongong. Really cool. Okay, so first of all, I thought because by popular request, people are wanting to see Enzo, my new puppy. So I have got him here. You may be hearing chewing sounds. So that's actually Enzo having a nice little chew over in his pen there. So I'm just going to get him and introduce him and the other two as well, just while we're waiting for everyone to join. Actually, we might go with Fletcher and Opal first. Fletcher, can you come up here, buddy? Good boy. Good boy. So this is Fletcher. He's a very, very good boy. Boston says hello. We're getting hellos from other doggies. And how about Opal? Opal, come up. Opal, ups. Oh, goodness. Okay. This is Opal. Opal also says hello. Their dad is home today, and he's sort of kicking around, so they would much rather be off hanging out with dad because mum's a bit boring in the office here. Hi from the UK. Oh wow, awesome. I don't even know what time it must be there at the moment. I'm thinking it's going to be pretty late at night. Alice. Quebec, Canada. Awesome. Okay, and I'm going to get Enzo real quick. Okay, he did not want to relinquish his chewy. So here's Enzo, very enthusiastically chewing on something. He's just dropped it. That's gross, dude. So Enzo is 10 weeks old tomorrow. So he's my new little guy. But yes, I thought we would just say hello to him. Look up here, Enzo. Enzo, wait, what's up here? Oh, here's your chewy. What's that? What's that? Good boy. He's a good boy. Okay, you can go back in here. Okay, I'm back. Now we can actually start diving into things. You're just here for the dogs. That's awesome. I love it. They are pretty cute. Awesome. Okay, everything seems to be working well, so that's good. So Welcome, my name's Charlotte Reeves. I've been a professional pet photographer for 13 years. I started my business in 2007. I actually started studying pet photography as soon as I left high school. I did a 2-year diploma of photography. That was in, showing my age, 1999 to 2000. And I sort of got to the end of my photography course and I wasn't sure quite what I wanted to specialize in. Pet photography wasn't really a thing back then. So I sort of thought, landscape photography, commercial photography maybe. I couldn't quite settle on what I wanted to do. So I ended up actually doing more study in graphic design and website design. And I ended up working as a designer. And it wasn't until I bought a digital SLR and got my first dog that was wholly and solely mine. Her name was Kaya. She was a Great Dane. And I actually got back into photography because of her. And I think a lot of you are probably in the same boat. You have a dog that you absolutely love and you want to start documenting their lives more. So you start taking photos of them and then it sort of develops and turns into this overwhelming passion, if you're anything like me. So I started my business in 2007 when pet photography wasn't really much of a thing. Certainly here in Australia, it was just starting to kind of take off a little bit in the States. And I think it was probably a few years in, I was getting a lot of questions from photographers, from other photographers wanting to sort of learn how I do what I do. So I started answering those questions and I started writing an ebook. I wrote an ebook, I wrote a second ebook. I started doing online mentoring, online in-person training, and then we started running workshops and it just sort of escalated from there. And now I have online courses. I really, really love teaching. Like I love explaining things to people. I love seeing those light bulb moments when people actually get things and they click. So I'm really hoping that we're going to have a few of those light bulb moments today with all of you guys, because shooting with manual exposure is something I'm pretty passionate about. And I really want to convey that to you guys and let you see how much of an advantage it can be in improving your skills and getting you creating really excellent intentional work. So I think that's pretty much it about me. I've been working with Nicole for a few years now. We do workshops together. This is the t-shirt from our very first workshop that we did together, Barcelona. That was back in 2016. We ran those with Kaylee Greer from Dog Breath Photography. We were supposed to run 2 of them this year, but that didn't happen. I'm guessing you guys know why. So we're hoping that will be next year instead now. So Nicole's Hair of the Dog Academy. So I run a monthly regular class in there called Critique Corner, where members of the Academy can submit their images and I will critique them and go through and explain ways that they could be improved both in the shooting and the editing side of things. And it's people have told me it's been really, really helpful for them in their photography. I'm also a guest instructor in Nicole's Elevate course program that she runs. And I also do like a monthly coaching call in there as well. And if you are a member of the Academy, you can actually see the first episode of my course Reel Shoots. So yeah, head to my website if you want to go check all that stuff out anyway. So it's www.learnpetphotography.com. So today, and let me just switch to my screen so we can see what's going on here. I've put together a keynote because I don't do things by halves. If you know me, you'll know that that's true. So show keynote. Okay, you can see my keynote hopefully. So you should be seeing a photo of Fletcher, Opal and Enzo. Let me know if you guys can see that. I can't put the slides full screen because then I can't see comments and things. So hopefully this is going to be okay for people and you can see it nice and clearly. Just let me know if that's the case. And you should see me down in the bottom left-hand corner as well. Okay, yes, we can see everything. That's really good. And Natalia has said Critique Corner is very helpful and she totally recommends it. It's really good. Okay. So what we're going to be talking about today, oh, I can put that over there, is simplifying manual exposure for pet photographers. And Fletcher agrees. Go find Dad. Go see Dad. He ran off. Okay, so just firstly a little bit about my journey with manual exposure. So when I learnt photography, I actually learnt on this camera, which is a Pentax K1000. So this is a really classic camera. I still have it. I absolutely love it. I've got a bit of a vintage camera collection. You can probably see him behind me. So the thing about the K1000, it was all manual. So it had a light meter, but you had to choose the shutter speed and the aperture, and you had to put film in it that was a particular ISO. So what this did is it forces you to make decisions about the images that you're shooting and how you're capturing things and making sure that you're getting correct exposure in the camera. So I ended up progressing to this camera. So this one, there we go, I think you can see that there. So this one ended up, this one does have automatic exposure modes. I do believe it has aperture priority and shutter speed priority. So I did progress to that. Now there was a gap of a number of years where I didn't really have a camera. And then when I got my first digital SLR, it was all automatic focus. It had automatic exposure. So I got a little bit lazy and I started shooting on aperture priority. So in 2007, when I started getting back into photography again, I did a project called Project 365 of 2007. And it was basically a photo a day project. And if any of you guys would like to improve your photography, I highly recommend doing a personal project like this. It's just absolutely invaluable in getting you out there shooting every day and really having photography on the brain constantly if you don't already. So total immersion, highly recommended. So I'll just flick through a few of the photos. I think I'm gonna need to change this to Acrobat. Okay, so these are a few of the images that I was taking in that year. I was basically, that was my puppy Kaya. It's like one of the very first photos I took of her. This is the photo that got me into pet photography, basically. So these are the sort of photos that I was taking. I was going out there and shooting every single day. Different things. A lot of puppy photos, but food, underwater stuff. I had a little underwater camera that I used to use every now and then. Macro stuff. And the other decision that I decided that I was going to do that year was to start shooting in manual again. So I set myself a challenge for that entire year. I was going to take a photo a day, and I was always going to have my camera in manual mode and never take it out of manual mode, because I wanted to deliberately make decisions about the settings of the images that I was taking. So that gives you a pretty good idea of that sort of, excuse me, I need to go organize this dog. 2 seconds. Okay, I'm back, sorry. Dogs are gone. Yeah, so this really forced me to learn how to shoot in manual. And I was experimenting like crazy. I was doing all sorts of stuff. I was doing long exposures. I was doing night shots. I was doing portraits, landscapes, macros, underwater stuff, cars, surfing, all kinds of stuff. So it wasn't necessarily all dog photos. Anyway, so you've got a pretty good idea of what that was all about. So I'm just going to go back to our keynote. Okay, so ever since 2007, which is incidentally the year I started my business, I've been shooting 99% manual exposure, pretty much always on manual exposure, and I'm actually quite passionate about it, if you hadn't guessed that already. So let's have a think about what exactly is exposure? So your camera sensor, it requires a specific amount of light coming in through the lens to record the image on the camera sensor. So it always needs that same amount of light coming through the lens. But the scenes that you're photographing are different sorts of brightnesses. So you might have a dark scene or a light scene. And the exposure settings, so the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO, control how much light comes through and in what ways the light comes through onto the sensor. So as you probably know, an underexposed image means there's not enough light coming through onto the sensor to form the image. An overexposed image, very bright image, which means there's too much light coming in onto the sensor and it's getting overwhelmed and it's just too much and it's too bright. So we've got your three elements of exposure, and I like to give these special names. So we've got shutter speed, which I like to call the technical element, aperture, which I like to call the creative element, and ISO, which I like to call the utility element. And we're going to dive a lot deeper into those a little bit further along. Just checking comments to make sure we're all good. Okay, we're all good. Everyone listening? Everyone's still with me? Okay, so on your camera, I'm assuming people have SLR cameras. If you don't, your phone might be a little bit different, or if you've got a compact camera, it might be a little bit different. Even phones, I found these days, generally have a mode that you can put them in where you have input into changing the exposure settings on the camera. So a really common one is auto. So basically, you take the photo, the camera decides everything. It decides the shutter speed, the ISO, and the aperture for you. Then aperture priority, where you select the aperture that you would like to use and the camera decides on the shutter speed. And then shutter speed priority, where you select the shutter speed and the camera decides on the aperture. So in all of these modes, the light meter reads the scene and then tells the camera what to do. Now, because it's just a little tiny microcomputer in there and it's not a big brain like we've got, sometimes doesn't get it quite right. Sometimes makes sort of kind of silly decisions. And it's not actually really getting all the information because it's seeing the scene, it's seeing it in terms of light and dark and contrast and things like that. But it doesn't know that that's a dog. It doesn't know that that dog might move quickly, therefore it needs a fast shutter speed. So the camera doesn't really have all the information to make the exact right decisions. So there are some problems you'll come across if you're using automatic exposure modes. One of the big things with photographing dogs, pets in general, is they come in all kinds of different colors. You have pure white, you have pure black, you've got everything in between, you've got different coat patterns, black and white, you've got different shapes and sizes. So the camera is looking and seeing that, but it's not really knowing how to deal with that very well. Another way that the camera may struggle if you're in automatic exposure mode is if you are photographing in tricky or combination lighting. So I'm mostly going to be, well, I'm predominantly a natural light photographer, so that's pretty much what we're going to be concentrating on here. We're not going to be talking about when you're going to be adding flash, off-camera flash, on-camera flash, anything like that. I'm talking about purely natural light. But when I say tricky or combination lighting, natural light can be that as well. So if you're shooting, say, a backlit shot, you have different types of light falling on your subject as opposed to falling on the background. So that's combination lighting. The camera will often struggle with if it's in automatic exposure mode. Another problem that you can have with an automatic exposure mode is shutter speeds that are too low to freeze the motion of pets. So I will ask, how many of you have ever taken a blurry photo of a dog? Because when you're photographing dogs, unlike people tend to stand kind of still, especially if they're being asked to stand and pose, they will stand still. Dogs are just, everyone, yeah, definitely. Dogs are just constantly moving. They're animals. They're always moving. So even just sitting still, they're still moving. They're breathing, their eyes are flicking to the side, their ears are flicking. They might suddenly look off over that way when they see something. They're constantly moving. So blurry photos is a really big problem that I see with people shooting in automatic exposure modes. Yeah, so lots of people chiming in here with blurry photos. And kids as well, yeah. Kids don't quite have the same degree of self-control as adults, so they move around quickly and randomly as well. If you're a child photographer or a family portrait photographer, you've probably found the same thing. So another problem with automatic exposure modes is you get quality issues when the ISO gets pushed too high. So sometimes the camera will decide to fix the exposure. It'll be told by the light meter that the image is too dark, and so it'll just put that ISO high, and sometimes it puts it really high without you realizing it. So I'm sure, again, if I asked a question to you guys, if you've ever had a photo, been shooting on automatic and you had a photo that's really, really grainy, it's shot at like ISO 5000 or something like that. Because the scene has suddenly gone dark or you've moved and you're shooting in auto, so you're not really keeping tabs on that kind of stuff. So those are some issues that you can have with automatic exposure modes. Okay, now let's look at the advantages of shooting on manual exposure. So the biggest thing I think, and the biggest way it affected me when I started shooting on manual, is it really forces you to take control over the session, or over, just going out and taking a photo. And it forces you to shoot deliberately and set your shots up with intention. So when you're shooting on auto, it's really easy to be shooting in this direction and then kind of just turn around and shoot in this direction. And you're like, oh, it's on auto, it'll just adjust, whatever. But you might have moved from like full sun to dark shade, and your camera is like scrambling to set the image to be perfectly exposed for you. But without your input in actually recognizing that the light has changed, it might make some pretty silly decisions. So taking note of the sort of light that your subject is in, and then thinking about, okay, so what do I need to change exposure setting wise to come up with a successful image here, it's a really good process to go through. It really makes you shoot deliberately and intentionally. Also, with manual exposure, you have much less chance of blurry or poor quality photos. So we talked about photos being blurry because the shutter speed is not fast enough because the dog moves, or poor quality because the camera decides to jack the ISO right up. It also forces you to make better exposure decisions because you're shooting with the editing in mind. So your camera doesn't know that you're going to edit the photo. But you can look at a scene and there can be a bright area in the background. And then you can be like, I think I'm going to underexpose that a bit because I don't want to blow out those highlights. I want to recover them when I'm editing. So you know that, your camera doesn't know that. So you can shoot intentionally to intentionally slightly underexpose that so you can fix it when you're editing. And the last thing is, huge thing, if you're out shooting pet photography sessions and you come home and you have 500 images to go through and you've got a bunch of photos, say you've got like 50 photos taken in exactly the same lighting and you've used exactly the same settings. Generally, what you can do is edit one photo and then either batch process or copy and paste those settings onto all of those images, and they will all be edited perfectly because the camera hasn't been making minute exposure differences in between frames. So you can actually edit a lot quicker in batches when the image is taken in the same lighting and you're using the same settings. So there are some reasons why you would want to shoot on manual exposure, I guess specifically for pet photography as well. Okay, so we're going to talk about some camera hacks. Everyone loves hacks. So there's a few camera hacks that I use when I'm shooting on manual. One of those things is, who's heard of blinkies, the term blinkies? So blinkies are actually highlight alerts. So when you're reviewing the image, so you've taken a photo, you're reviewing that photo in the back of your camera. Anything that's overexposed, if you've got your blinkies turned on, will blink. I'm going to show you what that looks like. I have my camera right here. So this is my current camera. So I went out and took a couple of bad photos this morning so I could show you guys. Okay, this is what blinkies look like. That's a very overexposed image. And see how there's some areas of the image that's actually brighter than it is, are blinking. Now, what that does is it tells you that there are parts of the image that are overexposed where there is no detail. There's no pixel information. You can't recover that. There's no way to get that information back once it's blinking. You can improve it a little sometimes, but you can never get it back totally. So blinkies are often found, and everyone's going to have a different make and model of camera, but generally in your camera settings, in your play settings of the camera, I've got a Canon. So for me, they're in this section here. I'll just show you really quickly. So you want to make sure those highlight alerts are enabled, and that will give you that blinking overlay. So when you're shooting in manual, the metering mode that you use is just a guide, and it's a guide for you. So I think any mode, any metering mode, and there's lots of different metering modes with cameras. There's evaluative, there's center weighted, and there's one called spot metering. And so I think that it's perfectly fine to have it on any other mode except spot metering, because what spot metering does is it takes a meter, so it reads the light in a particular small part of the image, and wherever you put that point, whatever you're pointing it at, it will read it from there. So if you put that spot meter point on a black dog, it's going to try and make that look grey, and so your whole image is going to be completely overexposed. If you put that spot on a white dog, it's going to go, oh, that's bright, I better make that grey, and it's going to darken the whole image. Or it's going to tell you that you should choose settings to make that image quite dark if you're shooting in manual. So use any metering mode that works for you, that you find you get good results from, except spot metering. And remember, the metering mode, it's not directly telling the camera what settings to use. It's telling you if it thinks that that scene is too bright or too dark, because you've got a little thing called a meter. I wonder if I can show you guys that. Okay. So let me just change this. I don't know if it's going to be easy to see. So see the little scale there? So, oh, it's just disappeared. Hang on. There's a little scale on your camera, and there's a little marker. And so you want to be able to see where that little marker is in the scale when you're shooting. Anyway, we'll get back to that. We'll get back to that a little bit later. There will be a replay of this. Susan and Kelly, the lens is, this is a Canon EOS R5, and it's an RF 70 to 200 lens. So it's the mirrorless 70 to 200. I love it. It's amazing. Okay, so another thing that's really handy to have on your camera, another camera hack, is for you to be able to review the images with the histogram enabled. Now we're going to talk about histogram a little bit more later, but I'll show you what that looks like too. I'm not quite sure why I'm having a technical glitch. Sorry guys, talk amongst yourselves. Okay, there we go. Oh. I took a photo that was completely underexposed, and I'm trying to review it on the back of my camera, and it's black, and I'm like, why can't I see it? Because it was black. Anyway, like I said, my first day. Okay, so this is what it looks like when you have the histogram enabled on the back of your camera. There we go. So see that little graph there? That's a histogram, and that will indicate to you whether your image is overexposed or underexposed when you're shooting on manual. Okay, sometimes with Canon cameras, you need to press the info button to cycle through the various views to be able to view that histogram. I think it's pretty similar on most cameras. So this is when you're reviewing images that you've already taken. So I always review images with that histogram enabled. So Susan's asked, any metering mode, it won't matter when shooting, even shooting manual. No, because whatever metering modes you choose, it's just for you. It's just your information. And then you can take that information and use the knowledge that you have to decide on the exposure setting. So the camera is not using that metering mode to set the exposure. So as long as it's not on spot metering, you're sweet. Okay, another thing you might want to do, camera hack, is to configure your controls to make ISO changes easy and quick. So when I'm shooting, the way that I shoot, the manual exposure methods that I use, I am often changing ISO. I am much less often changing aperture and shutter speed. So I'm changing ISO a lot. So I've configured, and it's different for every camera, so I can't really show you it on mine, but I've configured the controls. So to change shutter speed, I use this little dial here. To change ISO, I use this dial on the back. And to change aperture, I use this dial here. So some cameras, you actually need to press a button before you can use the dial to change ISO. So on my old camera, it was set up like that as standard. And I found a way to actually swap aperture and ISO because I was changing ISO more often. So to change aperture, I had to press the button and do the dial. But if I wanted to change ISO, I'd just do the dial because it's nice and quick. Because you want to make things nice and quick and easy for you to do when you're shooting, because it's like one less thing to think about, because you have so many things to think about when you're out photographing pets. And Amanda says that my new camera must be light. Yes, or maybe I'm just strong. I don't know. It's all the muscles that I built up from having my, my 1DX has made me strong. I don't think it's super light. Okay, so there's some good camera hacks. All right, so I said we'd talk more about the histogram. Who here understands what a histogram is, and who here has no idea what I'm talking about? I'm guessing we're going to have people at both ends of the spectrum. So I'm not going to go into it in heaps of detail because you really can go into it in heaps of detail. I'm in the process of writing my new ebook and I have pretty much an entire chapter about the histogram. But we're not going to go into that much detail here. So, histogram. What's your experience level, folks? Let me know. None. Okay. Awesome. That's good. Okay, so histogram basics. Okay, cool. Histogram is basically a very nerdy graphical representation of all the tones in your image. Oh, by the way, I should have mentioned earlier, this slideshow that you're seeing, this keynote, it's going to be available for download as a PDF after I finish this session. So I should have mentioned this earlier. You don't need to take notes. You're going to be able to download this as a PDF because there's quite a bit of information coming through here. Very comfortable with histograms. They know what it is, don't know how to use it. Always use it. Use it, but need to learn more. Okay, so we've got a whole... Oh. It's telling me I was interrupted. All right, am I back now? Oh, I love live stuff. Screen froze. Okay, we're back now. Okay, we seem to be back. Cut out a bit. Back now. Yep. Oh, Karen, hi. No problems. Excellent. Okay, let's continue. So, histogram is basically a very nerdy free... Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. I live in the country. I have really terrible internet. Okay. Histogram is a very nerdy, and I'm a little bit of a nerd, so it suits me just fine. It's a graphical representation of all the tones in your image. So if you think of a photo and you think of all the individual little pixels in that photo. So you pull them out of the photo, you mix them all up, and then you sort them in order of brightness stacked into a graph. That's what a histogram is. So say you take a photo where you've got a very bright sky and a very dark subject. You pull them all out, mix them up. All the dark tones from the subject get stacked at the left and then progressively lighter through your medium tones to your very lightest tones. So what you end up with is a graph that shows you the left-hand side, all the dark pixels, and at the right-hand side, all the bright pixels. And so histograms, there's no perfect histogram. People get hung up on the idea that the histogram needs to look perfect. It needs to go like this. And there has to be a certain, number of dark tones and a certain number of light tones. It's just, don't worry about that. Every histogram is going to look different depending on the light tones and the dark tones in the image. So this isn't talking about the colors of the tones, it's talking about how bright or dark they are. So it's a luminance histogram. So the aim when you're shooting to get correct exposure is to fit that range of tones in the scene onto the histogram. So I took these photos earlier. We're going to have a quick look at this. Okay, so I went out and took these terrible photos this morning so I can share them with you. So we're looking at them on the back of my camera and we're paying special attention to the histogram. Okay, so don't worry about the red, green, blue bits at the bottom. Just look at the white histogram here. So this is the overexposed image. Sorry, I'm trying to get this in the right spot. This is the sorry, I'm terrible at this, that we saw before. And as you can see, the histogram, all those tones are clustered at the right-hand side of the histogram. So there's no dark tones, there's no dark pixels in that image. They've been pulled out of the image, sorted, stacked into the histogram, and all of them are squished up against the top there. And that is why the image is overexposed. Okay, now we're going to look at an underexposed image, which is this one here. So as you can see, the image is quite dark. Oh God, I'm really bad at holding this, aren't I? The image is quite dark. And you can see that the tones in the histogram are all stacked up against the far left-hand side. And that means that all those tones in the image are dark tones. So the image is underexposed. Okay, so now we're going to look at an image that is correctly, properly exposed. So we've got an image here of my willing models. It's looking really bright on the screen, but this is actually properly exposed. And you can tell because the histogram, see how all the tones fit perfectly, that there's no overflowing tones, there's no tones pushed up against the left-hand or right-hand end of the histogram. They all fit on that graph. And so that's how we know that image is correctly exposed. Okay, does that make sense? Please let me know if that makes sense. Hopefully I haven't frozen again. Okay, so we've got the histogram sorted. So even if you have never heard of a histogram before, I'm hoping that explanation will explain just what you need to know to be able to use the histogram when you're shooting, for the histogram to be able to indicate to you whether your image is overexposed, underexposed, or correctly exposed. This is aside from just looking at the image on the back of the camera. So generally you can tell just by looking at the image, but the histogram is like the nerdy version. It's like the graphical representation of the image, and it sometimes gives you a bit of extra information. Yeah, so basically, Joe has asked, as long as each section has a bit of graph in it. Yeah, so as long as you can see information contained within the histogram. If it's pushed all the way up to one side, generally that means there's heaps of dark tones and no light tones, or heaps of light tones and no dark tones. That gives you an indication whether it's overexposed or underexposed. So think of that graph as what the sensor can handle, what the sensor can capture. Okay, makes sense. Excellent. Let's move on. Okay, so we're going to talk about the 3 elements of exposure specifically for us, specifically for pet photographers. So most genres of photography will have certain go-to or at least starting point sessions. So when you think about landscape photography, I don't know if any of you guys are landscape photographers, you're generally going to be shooting at a pretty deep depth of field because you want everything in the scene to be nice and sharp. So a lot of landscape photographers will actually shoot using a tripod. so that they can have a very deep depth of field, and that might mean they have to use quite a slow shutter speed. So that's specific to landscape photography. And then you might have, say, a photographer that captures football, and they shoot football and there's people running around all over the place, and they need to like quickly change who they're focusing on, and they don't want blurry images. They want nice sharp images of someone being tackled from the side and sweat flying everywhere. Like, you want to capture all these details. So their main prerogative is a nice fast shutter speed. And it doesn't matter if the depth of field isn't very deep, because they're pretty much focusing on this guy running over this way. So someone who photographs football as opposed to someone who photographs landscapes, they're going to have different settings that they want to use. So same with pets. And portraiture as well. So pet photography really is a form of portraiture, but instead of people standing there being told to stand there because I'm taking a photo of you, we can't convey that to dogs. So we have to assume that these dogs are fast and random, and we have to choose settings that will be able to handle that in case they move, because we don't want blurry photos, remember. So with pet photography, manual exposure, some settings you'll change more often than others. So let's have a look at those. Okay, first up, we have aperture. So I wanted to show you guys something, just in case this wasn't something that you were aware of. I'm going to take the lens off my little Pentax K1000, and I'm going to show you what aperture is. I tested this before, so I'm hoping this works. So aperture is basically the size of the hole in the lens. If it's a big hole in the lens, it lets lots of light in. If it's a small hole in the lens, it doesn't let much light in, and you have to get light onto the sensor in different ways. So I've got a little aperture dial on this lens. See all those numbers there? And I can change that manually. So this is how you used to change aperture when you were shooting with these old film cameras. So when you actually look through the lens, I've got to get a good hold of this, you can actually see that hole changing size. So there's a series of, it's called a diaphragm, there's a series of little overlocking blades in there that change the size. That is what aperture is. And it's really interesting because you can actually see it. So aperture is probably one of the really hard things to get your head around, but actually seeing that hopefully gives you a bit more information as to actually what it actually does. So, oh, nearly dropped it. I'm gonna stick that back on there. Okay, so as well as controlling the size of the hole in the lens and how much light gets through, you're also controlling how much of the image is going to be in sharp focus. So I'm going to go to this diagram. I know we love diagrams. Okay, so we actually saw those blades. So all these little graphics here, we actually saw them in the lens that we just looked at. So the bigger the hole, the smaller the number. It's opposite. It's incredibly confusing. It's the hardest thing to get your head around in photography as a whole, I think. So large hole, lots of light, small number. So the larger the hole, the less is in focus as well. So say you focus on a particular spot. If you've got a large aperture, which is a small number, you're going to have just that little slice of focus. It's going to be in good focus. Anything in front of that is going to be blurry. Anything behind that is going to be blurry. As you're moving through and changing that hole to be smaller, you're going to get more in focus and the number is going to get higher. Again, this is something that you will have in your PDF download that you could maybe take a photo of, put it on your camera, refer to it when you're shooting, just to give you a bit of a refresher of how this incredibly difficult thing to get your head around works. Okay. So going back to aperture. So it's an easy thing to remember when you're shooting pets. Because, as we've talked about, pets move quickly, you need a fast shutter speed so you don't get blurry photos. You need to get lots of light onto the sensor in another way. An aperture is a really good way of getting lots of light onto the sensor. The bigger the hole, the more light comes through the lens, so the less you have to get light in other ways. I recommend, while you're getting used to shooting on manual, just keep it wide open. So the biggest hole, the smallest number that your lens is capable of. Different lenses are capable of different maximum apertures. If you have a 24-70 or a 70-200, those are pretty common zooms. They are generally f2.8 is the largest aperture you can choose. So I recommend, as long as you're shooting just one subject, stick it on f2.8 and leave it there. And that will also help you with focusing too, because that's forcing you to be very accurate with what you're focusing on, because it's a very shallow slice or plane of focus, and there's not a lot of room for error with your focusing. So keeping a nice big aperture, small number, full time, gets you lots of light onto the sensor and also helps you with being accurate with your focusing. That is my recommendation for pet photographers with aperture. Okay, so we've had a look at that. Let me just check comments. Okay, now we're moving on to shutter speed. Okay, so shutter speed is the technical element. Again, two purposes. So the first one is a technical purpose. It controls how much light falls onto the sensor again, but instead of being related to the size of the hole, it's related to how long the shutter is open for. So when you're just looking through your camera and doing stuff and not taking photos, your shutter is closed, there's no light getting through onto your sensor. When you take a photo, the shutter opens and then closes again. So for how long it opens is the speed of your shutter. That's your shutter speed. If it opens and closes really quickly, like that, that's a very fast shutter speed. If it opens and closes like that, it's a slow shutter speed and more light gets onto the sensor. So that's the technical side of shutter speed. Second purpose is it determines if the image is sharp or blurry. So say you take a photo, the shutter opens and closes really quickly. The subject, so what you're taking a photo of, if it's moving around a little bit, but if it's happening really quickly, really fast shutter speed, it's going to freeze that motion and you're going to end up with a sharp, even if the subject was moving, you're going to end up with a sharp image because the light was not coming through onto the sensor for a very long period of time. If you've got a slow shutter speed like this and the subject's moving, you're actually going to get that image through onto the sensor while the subject's moving, and that is where the blur is coming from. So fast shutter speed freezes movement, slow shutter speed, you'll get blur. So with pet photography, again, this is a pet photography specific thing, and this is something I recommend from experience. So from 13 years of photographing fast moving little creatures like dogs and cats and sometimes horses and sometimes other little creatures, they move quickly, they move randomly. Whenever you're shooting a portrait, so a portrait you assume the subject is still, but we don't assume the subject is still because we know that dogs are always moving, even slightly, and they may suddenly start moving quickly and randomly. For portraits, you want to keep that shutter speed at 1/500th of a second or above, and if possible, faster. There's nothing wrong with going fast and using like 1/4000th of a second. The only difference it makes is it lets less light onto the sensor. So for portraits, dogs, always keep above 1/500th of a second. I've seen motion blur in a dog at like 1/250th of a second. It might seem like a fast shutter speed, but if your subject moves within that time, you will get blur. For action, if you're shooting dogs in action, that's when it starts getting a bit crazy. You want to keep that shutter speed above 1/1000th of a second, and you want to go faster if you possibly can. There's no such thing as too fast when it comes to shutter speed and shooting dogs in action. So 2 numbers, that's the only 2 numbers. They're nice, simple numbers to remember. 1/500th of a second for portraits, and 1/1000th of a second if the dog is in action or moving. Okay, last one. Okay, is that all making sense so far? Please let me know. Okay, Kelly has said, if you have more than one subject and they aren't quite on the same focal plane, one will be blurry. Yes, that is exactly right. And that is one of the situations where you may choose to increase your depth of field. Towards the end of this talk, we're going to be going through a bunch of example images, and I'm going to show you the settings that I've used to take certain photos and why I've chosen those settings. So that f2.8, or the biggest aperture that you possibly want to use, that's generally when you're just shooting one subject because you want one thing in focus. You may need to increase your depth of field if you have multiple subjects. We're going to see examples of that later on. And she's also asked, would that push your ISO up too high, being at 1/1000th of a second? So this is all depending on also the sort of light that you're shooting in. So if you're shooting in good, plentiful outdoor light, it's keeping your shutter speed high is more than achievable. Sometimes your ISO might need to go up high, but we'll talk about that next. So, okay, last one, ISO, the utility element. So I showed you before what ISO comes from. So here is a roll of 35mm film. This one is 400 ISO. This one is 200 ISO. Another common one was 100 ISO and 800 ISO. 800 ISO was like sports film. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember this. So before, when you were shooting with a regular film camera, you actually had to choose the correct film that you wanted depending on what you were planning to shoot with that roll of film. So if I was going out and shooting I didn't really photograph pets with film cameras, but if I was going out and shooting something in action, so maybe I was going and shooting like a horse show or a dog show with dogs trotting around, I would choose a fast film and put that in my camera, and I would be always shooting at ISO 800 with my 800 film. So what makes film fast or slow? Okay, so the smaller the number with ISO, the more fine-grained the film is. So the little crystals in the film that form the image, they're very fine-grained, and they form a more higher quality image, but it takes longer to get those little crystals to react. Therefore, you need more light onto them for longer to get those crystals to form the image. If you're shooting with, this one's a little bit faster, but if you're shooting with like a high ISO film, the little crystals in the film are actually bigger, so the image isn't as fine-grained, the image quality isn't as good, but they react quicker. And so they don't need as much light to form the image. So that is how ISO works with film. Now, how that translates to the sensor in your camera, instead of talking about grain, you're talking about digital noise. So the ISO is how sensitive your sensor is to the light. So if the sensor is very sensitive to the light, it's going to react really quick, it's going to form the image really quick and easily, but it's going to suffer quality-wise. So you might end up with some digital noise. If you are shooting with a low ISO, the sensor is going to react a lot slower. It's going to need more light onto it, but it's going to give you a finer quality image. So the only visual effect on the photo of your ISO choices is the noise and the image quality. So low ISO means high quality, but it reacts slower. It's not as sensitive. High ISO means a grainy, noisy image quality, but it reacts really quickly. It's very sensitive. Does that make sense? Okay. I'm just looking at comments. How do I still have that film? Yeah, I know, it's been sitting in my cupboard. I have a box of film. This is my film box that I've had for I don't know, 20 years. This is what sits in my fridge. Every time I move house, I move this. I think they're all expired. They probably would still form an image, and it would be really interesting to see what they do. And I also have these old cameras that I've been meaning to put the film through. I'll get there one day. And I've got medium format film as well. So this is like 6x6 negative size in negative and positive. Anyway, camera nerd, film nerd. Okay. So your idea with ISO, you want to keep it as low as you possibly can because you want as good a quality as you possibly can in your images. So ISO should be the last decision that you make when deciding on exposure settings. So in a way, shutter speed and shutter speed and aperture are more important because they control other things about how the image looks. They control the depth of field, they control whether the image is sharp or blurry. All ISO does is control the quality of the image and how sensitive that sensor is and how much light it needs. Also, keep in mind, noise can be fixed or improved in the editing stage. Lightroom does a really fantastic job of dealing with noise because it's also dealing with the raw data in the image. There's also other plugins and things that you can get for Photoshop. I think Topaz, I don't use it myself, but I've heard it's a really good way of dealing with noise. So you are able to fix a noisy image to a certain extent, to a pretty big extent sometimes. You cannot fix a slow shutter speed. You cannot fix motion blur in an image. You can't fix the depth of field. It's not how you originally wanted to shoot it. Those things cannot be fixed. Noise can. So that's why it's your utility element. Okay. So again, because you're wanting to change ISO to your utility element a lot, you want to customize your camera to make those changes really quickly and easily. Because this is the setting that I change the most. And now we're going to have a look at some more graphs because I'm a nerd and I like graphs and tables and spreadsheets and all that sort of thing. I think I'm probably more of can you guys still see me or not? Are we back? I know I'm live. I'm sorry. So we're actually getting a truckload of soil delivered, which wasn't meant to be for an hour, and they've turned up early. So if you hear noises in the background, that's what you're going to be hearing. So I apologize for that. The dogs should love playing in all that. It's actually in a garden bed, Travis, so I'm hoping they don't get in there and cause a ruckus. Okay. All right, I'm just going to continue. You can always catch the replay. So, I was saying about how ISO is the setting that I change the most. So I change ISO way more when I'm shooting than I change aperture and shutter speed. So what I did is, because I love graphs so much, I actually made graphs of the various different apertures, shutter speeds, and ISOs that I use. And what I did is I got all the images in my portfolio. I used to have on my website a portfolio of about 50 photos. I don't recommend this. It escalated and I ended up with 50 photos on there. I don't know how. Anyway, I got all those photos and I looked at the stats for all those photos and I made a graph. Here we go. So this is a graph of the aperture of my portfolio images. So as you can see, I shoot predominantly at f2.8 because I use my lenses, my 70 to 200 mostly, and my 24 to 70. And the maximum aperture on both those lenses is f2.8. So I shoot a lot at f2.8. I also shoot, there's a little spike there at f2 because I've got a couple of prime lenses and I often shoot with them at f2. So that's an even bigger aperture, smaller number. If I'm shooting groups or multiple dogs, I will take that up to f3.2, f3.5, f4. I don't often shoot higher than f4. Very occasionally I will. Now, this is all going to depend on you and your style, whether you like including the background. This is just me, but I have found that a lot of pet photographers do prefer to shoot at a shallow depth of field to create that look in their images, and also to make sure that they get a lot of light, because remember the size of the hole in the lens, to get a lot of light through, so that you can use a fast shutter speed. Which brings me to, I'm sorry about the beeping in the background, that's the truck that's just turned up to deliver a load of soil into our new garden bed. Okay, so this is shutter speed of portfolio images. So as you can see, I don't hardly ever shoot below 1/500th of a second. Very occasionally, if my subject is very still, cats seem to hold a little bit more still than dogs. They get that frozen kind of stare. So a lot of anything that's slower than 1/500th is generally a cat, or a dog that's holding very, very still, so that I can safely take that shutter speed down a little bit. Pretty much my shutter speeds start at 1/500th of a second. 1/640 is my most common shutter speed, so it's a little bit faster than the 1/500th minimum for shooting portraits. And then we've got another little bit of a spike down here, 1/1000th, that's my minimum for shooting action, up to 1/250th, 1/1600th, 1/2000, 1/2500th. So these are all action shutter speeds at this end. Yeah, so we're not talking about studio photography in this particular talk. So definitely if you are shooting with off-camera flash, if you are shooting in the studio, this is not going to apply. This is when you're shooting outdoors with natural light. So do I use 2.8 if I want to get the eyes and nose in focus? So I'm one of these people, I don't care about noses. I don't care about blurry noses. If a nose is blurry in a photo, so be it. I don't want the nose to be sharp, because I think a sharp nose can take focus away from the eyes. For me, the eyes are the most important thing in the photo. If you are shooting to enter professional competitions, they will often require that the whole face be in focus. And this is kind of a bit of a leftover thing from shooting people. People have very flat faces as compared to, say, I don't know, a greyhound, where you've got the eyes and the nose like this far from each other. So in order to get like the eyes and the nose of a greyhound in sharp focus, you have to really change that aperture. So I just prefer just to keep the eyes in focus. That's just me. If you do want to keep the eyes and the nose in focus, you will have to increase your depth of field, which means you will have to make your aperture smaller, which is a larger number. Okay, so that is shutter speed of portfolio images. So with these two, so far, with aperture and shutter speed, you can see they don't change them a lot. So pretty much f2.8 and one between 500 and 800, 1600, 1/2000 for action. That's pretty much my go-to. Okay, ISO. So these are the ISOs of all my portfolio images. As you can see, there's a much wider range of values, and there's a bit of a spike around ISO 500, 640, 800, maybe 1000. There's a bit of a spike in the middle there because they're common ISOs that I use. But there's also other values there. And I definitely change ISO a lot more often than I change shutter speed and aperture. Okay, so if you like me and you like nerdy graphical graphy type things, there you go. Okay, now we're getting into the fun stuff. It's all fun, but this is the practical stuff, I suppose. So when you go to take a photo, how do you determine how to set the exposure manually? So we've got a process here, step-by-step process. First thing you should decide on is the aperture. I recommend keep it wide open. You get the most amount of light through that you possibly can. If you keep it there, set and forget, unless you're photographing multiple subjects or for some other reason you want to increase the depth of field, just keep it wide open, nice and easy. So for me, if I'm shooting with this 70 to 200 millimeter lens, it's pretty much always on f2.8. So shutter speed. That's your second thing that you should be thinking about. First thing to think about is, are you shooting portrait or are you shooting action? If you're shooting a dog sitting there, it's the owner's holding it on the lead, or you've asked it to stay. If it's got a good stay, if you get really, really lucky, some dogs know how to stay. If the dog is kind of sitting there, not moving around too much, 1/500th of a second, that should be your minimum. If you're shooting action, or if you're shooting candid sort of shots where the dog's moving around, 1/1000th of a second should be your minimum. And that's so you can freeze the motion of the subject to give you a sharp image of the subject. Okay, step three. Now you're wanting to actually point the camera at what you're wanting to shoot, and you're going to change the ISO while looking at your little light meter, and change that ISO until that little marker in the light meter is in the center. And so that's the light meter telling you, oh, I think that's the correct exposure. So you've got your aperture, you set your shutter speed, and then you adjust your ISO while referring to the light meter. And that should be the correct exposure. So then you want to take a test shot. So whenever I'm taking test shots, say I'm working with a client and I'm getting a particular shot of a dog in a particular scene, I don't get them to set the dog up as if I'm taking the photo just to take a test shot. I will often just hold the camera like this and shoot in a general direction and just make sure that I'm getting that kind of scene. That's generally enough for a test shot. So I take the test shot, look at the back of the camera, look at the histogram, and see if all the tones in the histogram fit onto that graph. If I take a test shot, look at the histogram, and I see there's tones pushed up against the left-hand side or pushed up against the right-hand side, and the image looks bright or dark and the blinkies are going, I know that exposure is not correct. So I will then go and change the exposure accordingly. So how you change it after looking at a test shot is next. Okay, let me look at comments. Are we all good? So Travis has asked, for the light meter, do I use spot meter or evaluative? Definitely my preference would be evaluative, basically anything other than spot. You don't want to use a spot meter because your subjects are a whole range of different colors and tones. And spot meter is really good for skin tones on, I guess, Caucasian people with lighter skin. And that will give you a good result if you use a spot meter. If you use a spot meter on a black dog as opposed to a white dog, the light meter is going to tell you all sorts of crazy stuff. So stay away from spot metering unless you're using it for a specific reason, unless you're shooting with a grey card. There are reasons to use spot metering, but in general, steer clear of spot metering and stick to one of the other ones. So center weighted, evaluative, matrix, there's a few different types. Anything that gives you a nice result. So if you're pointing the camera at the scene and you're adjusting your ISO until that marker is in the middle of your light meter, and you take the test shot and it looks perfect, that's a good metering mode to use. So stick with that one. Okay, so if your shot is underexposed, so underexposed means too dark. That means you need to get more light onto the sensor or make the sensor more sensitive to light. So how do you make the sensor more sensitive? You increase the ISO. So you make the ISO a bigger number. I think I've messed this up. Make the sensor more sensitive to light. This should be more. Okay, I fixed it. So you want to increase the number to make the sensor more sensitive to light. It will give you a worse quality in your image, which you can fix in editing in most cases, but it will mean you correctly expose the image. Okay, so my first step is always to change the ISO. In some cases, you might want to change one of the other settings. So you could also make the aperture bigger, because remember, an underexposed shot means there's not enough light getting through to the sensor. Therefore, you need more light onto the sensor. Therefore, if you can make your aperture bigger, that's a good way to get more light onto the sensor to correctly expose your image and make it not so dark. Another way that you can do that is make the shutter speed slower, so it's open for longer. Because remember, shutter speed's fast and then slow. But what happens if we get a slow shutter speed? The subject moves while the shutter's open, you get blur. So it can be a bit risky to take your shutter speed slower if you're already at the minimums that I've specified that you should be using when photographing pets. Okay, alternatively, if your shot is overexposed, so if the image is too bright, so when you look at the histogram, if all the tones are pushed up against the right-hand side of the histogram, if you've got your blinkies going off on the back of the camera, too much light, too bright onto the sensor. So you need to allow, just one step backwards. I really should mention, if your shot is underexposed and you'll find you're using really high ISOs, you can't make the aperture any bigger, you can't make the shutter speed any slower, you need to move or change the way that you're shooting so that your environment is brighter. So if you're shooting under the trees in the shade and your ISO is really high, aperture is big, your shutter speed is as slow as it can go, and it's still dark, go find some better light. That's the best thing that you can possibly do. Anyway, so if your shot is overexposed, image is bright, you need to allow less light onto the sensor or make the sensor less sensitive to light. So how do we do that? We decrease the ISO. So you choose a smaller number for the ISO. So like 100, 200, 400. That's a pretty small ISO. And that makes the sensor less sensitive, and also it helps improve the quality of the image. If you're taking the ISO down, you're improving the quality. So alternatives, if the image is overexposed, you can increase the shutter speed. So if you're shooting in full sun and your image is overexposed, increasing that shutter speed is and your ISO is already quite low, increasing the shutter speed is a really good way to allow less light onto the sensor so it's not so bright. So it basically means the shutter speed is open for less time, less light is getting in when the shutter is open. Another way that you can do it is make the aperture smaller. So aperture smaller, bigger number, more in focus. So remember this. So a small aperture, so f8, tiny hole in lens, not much light gets in, but lots of the image is in focus. So that's kind of a creative decision that you need to make. If you want to lose your nice blurry background that you've strived so hard to create, so you've got a nice sharp subject against a nice blurry background, making your aperture smaller is going to make more of the image in focus. So you're much better increasing the shutter speed or decreasing the ISO if you can, if that's the look that you want in your images. Okay, are we all following? Okay, there's no more questions so far, so that's good. We're going to look at some example images. So this is where we actually see it all put into practice. If anyone has any questions about what I've covered so far, now is your time to ask. I think we're good. Unless there's a huge delay. I'm not seeing any pressing questions coming through. So that's good. Okay, so we're going to have a look at some example images, real life examples. So first up, we're going to look at some examples of images where I have chosen the exact settings that I've talked about here. Hang on, that sounded like a comment. Sue has asked, going back, do you ever use the color channels with the histograms? When I'm editing, the color channels give me extra information about the image, or really just back up what I'm seeing in the photo. When I'm shooting, I don't really refer to the color channels, because all the color channels are doing is saying, if I'm shooting a bright blue sky, there's going to be lots of blue at the right hand side. It's not really giving me any information I can act upon or change my settings based on that. So really I'm just looking at the black and white one, so the luminance histogram. I'm not really taking much notice of the different color ones. Right, so real life examples. So we're going to start off with my go-to exposure settings. So this image here, it's been shot at f2.8. So this would have been shot with my 24 to 70 mil lens, probably at 24 millimeters. It's a pretty wide angle shot. It was shot in the shade, but it's nice bright open shade. So there was a wall behind the dog, but nice clear open sky. So it's in the shade, but it's quite bright shade. So it was shot at f2.8, 1/500th of a second, which is my absolute minimum for shooting portraits. And the ISO I've selected in order to properly expose the image was ISO 1250. A note about ISOs, generally the better the camera that you have, the better it will perform. So the better quality you'll get from high ISOs. If you've got a real entry-level camera, you might find that pushing the ISO up beyond like ISO 1250, 1600, it's going to look, or even over ISO 1000, you're going to start seeing that noise and grain in your photos. Whereas with a camera that costs a few $1,000s, whatever brand it is, generally will have better ISO performance. So better quality at higher ISOs. So because I'm always shooting with professional bodies, I can quite safely take that ISO up to whatever I need it to be. ISO 2000, I'm really not getting that much noise. And anything that I do get, I can fix. So that is kind of dependent on the camera that you've got, how comfortable you feel pushing that ISO high. If you find that you're always pushing your if you find that you're always pushing your camera to a higher ISO, and your camera cannot handle higher ISOs, you need to find a brighter environment to shoot in. So you need to control the environment that you're shooting in. So find lots more ambient light in your environment, because that will allow you to use an ISO that's not quite so high. Okay. How much post-processing does this photo have? It's kind of hard to say how much exactly. It's been post-processed, so every image that I take is put through Lightroom and Photoshop. This is a client image, so it's been put through both. It will have been adjusted to make sure the exposure is spot on, the contrast is good, the white balance is good. I've manipulated the tones in the image, so I've got a nice range of tones in the image. I would have taken it into Photoshop to maybe sharpen the eyes a little bit more, maybe blur the background a little bit more. I fully edit all the images that my clients get. Some images require more editing than others. This wouldn't have required a huge amount of editing. Probably just a bit extra contrast and probably warming up would have been the main things I did to this image. Do I consider the Nikon D500 a good camera body for more than 1000 ISO? Natalia, I'm really not sure. I'm a Canon girl, so I'm not really up on the exact Nikon models. The best thing you can do is take a series of test shots at different ISOs and then work out how much noise reduction and sharpening you can do on those to get the result that you want. So it's all going to be down to your own testing, shooting at different ISOs to work out how high you're comfortable going with your camera body. Okay, so next image. Okay, so this one was shot in very low light. So it's been exposed in such a way that it's not dark because of the settings that I've chosen. So this has also been shot at f2.8 at 1/500th of a second. The lights in the background this was right on dusk. So the lights in the background are fairy lights in the tree, but the dogs are facing towards a wide open expanse of sky. The sky was still fairly bright. The sun had probably just gone down. So the ISO had to be reasonably high in order to properly expose the image. So Andrea's asking about autofocus modes. It's kind of a little bit outside the scope of what we're talking about here. I always have my camera on servo. I always have my camera on continuous autofocus. I never use one shot. So because dogs are always constantly moving even when they're sitting still. That's the really super quick answer to that question. Okay, so next one. Okay, again, this is f2.8, 1/500th of a second. This was shot indoors. So in Australia, it's a really, really good idea to keep your cats inside. So pretty much any cat that I photograph is indoors. But the cat is facing towards a big open window. So there's enough light coming in through that window. I still had to use a reasonably high ISO, 1/250. It's not really that high for my camera. But I didn't want to put the shutter speed down any further because kittens are a little bit random and they can move pretty quickly. And I must have been shooting with a lens that didn't give me a wider a bigger aperture, to work with to get more light in that way. So I've just taken the ISO up to properly expose this image. Okay. This one here was taken at twilight. So twilight is my second favorite type of light to shoot in, second to backlighting. I love twilight on a beautiful, clear day with no clouds in the sky. That small amount of time just after the sun has gone down. It's a beautiful time of day to shoot. You get all these pastel tones in the sky. Anyway, can't go on enough about twilight. So for this one here, because this is an action image, I've taken the shutter speed up to my minimum for shutter speed, which is 1/1000th of a second. So that has been enough to pretty much mostly keep the dog sharp. There's a little bit of movement in the dog's extremities, so it would have been nice to take that shutter speed up a bit higher, and I probably could have, to be honest, because ISO 1000 isn't really that high on my camera. So I probably could have taken that shutter speed up to 1/2000th of a second and taken the ISO up to 2000, and it still would have been perfectly exposed, and I would have had a nice fast shutter speed, but the quality would have suffered just a little bit with my camera. This one here, very cute little husky puppy, very serious. So because this was a puppy, and puppies are random and they do things quickly and randomly and move around and twitch, and I've got one right now and it's a very random little puppy. I was shooting on a faster shutter speed. So technically this is kind of a bit of a portrait image because the dog sort of looks like it's standing still and looking something, but that was probably just like a fraction of a second when that dog was doing that, and the rest of the time it was a candid sort of style shot. So the rest of the time the puppy might have been sniffing around or looking over here or going over there. Because it was moving around, I chose a faster shutter speed. So that's why the shutter speed for this one is 1/1000th of a second. It was shade, but very bright shade, because it was next to a creek. There was an embankment that was shading where the dog was and sort of where the creek was, but all above was wide open sky. So there was quite a lot of light there, even though it was technically shade. Technically no direct sunlight was falling on the dog, but there was still quite a bit of light. So that's why my ISO isn't very high on this particular image. Okay, now we're moving into when you've got heaps and heaps and heaps of light to play with. So full sun will give you it's the brightest possible light that you can shoot in. Plenty of light. So this was shot at f2.8 because I wanted the shallow depth of field. And because I had so much light to work with, I could put that shutter speed up quite high. So you'll notice this isn't an action shot, but the shutter speed is still quite high because see how low the ISO is. I could not have taken that ISO down much further. I could have taken it down to ISO 100 maybe. So in order to make sure there wasn't too much light getting through to the sensor, I had to make the shutter speed really fast. So not open for as long. So that's why it's a very fast shutter speed, because there's heaps of light shooting in full sun. This next one is also full sun, but this is an action shot in full sun, which if you're starting off shooting action, I always recommend that you start off doing it in full sun. Full sun, whenever I say full sun, I mean full sun at the end of the day, not full sun directly overhead at noon, because that's just ugly. I mean full sun with the sun low in the sky. So this was also shot at f2.8, 1/2000th of a second, so a really nice fast shutter speed to freeze the action. So the dog looks nice and crispy and sharp. And again, the ISO was able to be quite low for this because there was so much light here. And we have another full sun shot. This is a shake shot. I love these ones. Also shot at f2.8. This was an even faster shutter speed, 1/2500th of a second. Very fast shutter speed. And the ISO was as low as it could possibly go. So this is all tying in really well, because in order to freeze water droplets, you actually need a really fast shutter speed. So all the water droplets in this image have been frozen because that shutter speed is so high. And the quality in this image is as good as it possibly can be because that ISO is so low. But I've only been able to do that because this image was shot in full sun with plenty of light. Okay, so other end of the scale. Siri has just decided to chime in on my laptop. Don't you love it when Siri gets involved? Let me just check comments. Okay, we're all good. All right, so other end of the scale, dark environments. So we've probably all tried to take photos when it's a little bit too dark, maybe. This image here, this was shot down in Tasmania earlier this year at Style Lab workshop that we did. So this was very early in the morning. This location was kind of like a tunnel of trees, so it was fairly dark, but you could see the rising sun kind of filtering through the trees in the background there. But where the dog was sitting was quite dark shade. So this again was shot at f2.8, 1/800th of a second, so a little bit higher than my minimum. I think I had it that high because there was a lot going on. We were at a workshop, so there were dogs moving around. There was multiple dogs there. There was multiple people shooting. I just wanted that shutter speed a little bit higher. But in order to correctly expose this image, I had to make the sensor really sensitive and really responsive to light by taking that ISO number up high. So that is quite a high ISO 3200. And on this image, I definitely had to do some noise reduction and sharpening. Just to help address that noise and keep the quality of the image nice. Next image, this was also taken at a workshop a few years ago. As you can see, this one's taken in the rain. You can actually see the water droplets there. So this Great Dane, as you know, if you've owned or been around Great Danes, they don't really usually move very quickly. So it was kind of a candid sort of shot. But I didn't feel like I needed a really fast shutter speed with this dog. So 1/640, which, as you know from looking at the graphs that we looked at before, that 1/640 is a very common shutter speed that I use. I know that it's fast enough to freeze any action, freeze any movement of the dog if the dog's just kind of moving slowly or sitting or standing there. But because it was quite dark, it was very heavy cloud that day. So the dog's standing in the open. The trees are in the background. There's clear sky. There's sky above the dog, but it's very cloudy sky. And cloudy cuts down the amount of light that you've got and makes it quite dark. So that's why the ISO was so high in this one. Okay, we've got another dark environment. So dark environment and action for this one. This dog was running through a pine forest. There was light behind, but where the dog was fairly dark. So this dog was super fast, like really, really fast. I really wish I could have used a faster shutter speed because there is a little bit of tiny movement. The face is pretty sharp, but there's a little bit of movement just in the legs, even at 1/250th of a second. So it's a pretty fast shutter speed and it's faster than the minimum that I recommend for action. Would have loved to have gone faster, but my ISO was already so high because it was a dark environment. So that ISO at 2500 made the sensor nice and sensitive. So it didn't need as much light to properly expose the image. But I did end up with some noise, which I then fixed in the editing stage. So I don't think it looks overly noisy. Okay, this is a really good example of shooting in a dark environment that was probably just a bit too dark. So this was also taken down in Tasmania at Style Lab workshop earlier this year. This forest we were shooting in got quite dark and everyone wanted to keep shooting, but we were really pushing ISOs high. So f2.8 again, as you can see, the shutter speed is the minimum that I would ever use for shooting action, 1/1000th, and the ISO is ISO 5000. This image is really quite noisy. Also because I underexposed it a bit as well, and so in brightening the image, that also reduces the quality. Okay, not ideal. Okay, let's have a look at what you can do when you're shooting with a different lens and you can use an even bigger aperture, smaller number, bigger aperture, less in focus. So this was shot with I think it was shot with my 35mm f1.4 lens. I was shooting with it at f2. Again, it's a kitten image, so it was shot indoors. There was a big window behind me, and you can actually even see a big window on the other side of the cat. So there's quite a lot of light coming through. It was a kitten moving around really quickly. 1/800th of a second was what I needed to be able to freeze the motion of the subject. And the ISO was whatever it needed to be to get the image exposed correctly. I have spoken before in this about referring to the light meter when you're shooting and adjusting the ISO until the little marker in the light meter is in the middle, and that'll tell you the exposure's right. I'll let you in on a little secret. I actually don't refer to the light meter when I'm shooting because I guess I've been shooting for so long, I can look at a scene and basically just know what settings to use. And I'm usually right within maybe a stop, half a stop, third of a stop. So within a couple of settings either side, I'm generally pretty much right. But when you are first starting out shooting manual, you will probably need to refer to that light meter and make sure that the little marker is in the middle to give you the ISO. Anyway, okay, so another dark environment. I was shooting with my 135mm prime lens that goes all the way down to f2. So I was able to shoot with a larger aperture, smaller number, more shallow depth of field. The dog was pretty much just sitting there. I was pretty much close to the minimum for portraits, and the ISO just needed to be 1:250 because the dog was kind of under a tree. It was sort of looking out to where, like an open clear area, but there was in quite a bit of shade there. Okay. Nearly finished. Okay, so this image was shot on a very cloudy day. As you can see the sky, you can see the clouds, you can see the flatness of the light, so the light isn't very contrasty. This was also shot with my 135mm f2 lens. This dog was really cool, but she was a little bit random. If you've got my Real Shoots course, Niku, this dog here, is actually one of the Real Shoots that I did. She was actually episode 6 of my Real Shoots course, and she was a real character. And she had a really high prey drive, and if she saw a turkey, we have bush turkeys here in Australia, which are a little bit different to the turkeys that you have over in other countries. If she saw a turkey, she would be liable to just go, just like dash off to the side. It would just instantly get her attention. So while it looks like she's standing here very serenely, looking at me perfectly still, you got to remember this was a moment. This was a very short moment. So I wanted to select a fast shutter speed. Also, even though it was a fairly dark kind of day because there were heavy clouds, there was still more light than there would be than if you were shooting in the shade, because she was out in a big wide open area. So I could keep the ISO quite low on this one here. Okay, so this is my opal. This was shot at the end of the day, just before the sun had gone down. You can see it sort of filtering through foliage in the background there. So this was shot with my new 50mm f1.2 lens that I am in so much love with. Oh, it's the best thing ever. I love that lens. And I'm pretty much only shooting with that lens at f1.2. f1.2 is a huge aperture, like the big aperture. It's a big hole in the lens. It's letting lots of light through onto the sensor. It's much bigger than f2.8. Because so much light is coming in through that hole in the lens, I can use a fairly fast shutter speed and a pretty low ISO. So that's one of the benefits of shooting with prime lenses that are capable of very big apertures, is you can get a lot of light in through that hole in the lens, and it means you can use a faster shutter speed and a lower ISO. So a less sensitive sensor because of the low ISO and a faster shutter speed. This one also was shot with my new 50mm lens. This is Fletcher in my garden. Again, this is really towards the end of the day. He was in the shade. There was some light on the background. The sun was very close to setting. Because I was shooting at f1.2, which is a big aperture, I could use a fast shutter speed and a low ISO. So this is one of the huge benefits of using a prime lens that's capable of very large apertures. Okay, now we're going to talk about last 4 images about when you should change other settings. So I've talked a lot about settling on your aperture and your shutter speed and using your ISO to get the right exposure. when you have multiple subjects, ideally you want your subjects lined up on the same plane. So lined up right next to each other so they're exact same distance from you and your camera. That will put them on the same plane. It will mean you can focus on one dog, and because the other dog is lined up perfectly next to it, the other dog will also be in focus. So you're not focusing on two subjects at the one time. You can only focus on one thing at once. But because the dogs are lined up perfectly, they will both be in focus. Now, that's in an ideal world. Working with animals, you know that you're not always in an ideal world with this kind of thing. So often the dogs may be not perfectly lined up. They're one might be a little bit in front or a little bit behind. I like to use a technique called positioning on the edge, which is trying to get the dogs on something, on the edge of something, so that forces them to stand next to each other and be perfectly aligned. So in this case, you can see they're sitting on a picnic table. If you can't do that, you do need to consider increasing your depth of field. So making your aperture smaller, which is a larger number, a higher number, which will give you more in focus on either side of your focus point. So that means if you focus on the dog in the front, the depth of field, so the plane of focus is going to be deep enough to also cover the other dog if it's sitting back a little bit. So even though these dogs are pretty well lined up, I often shoot a pair of dogs on f4. Another thing that I often do is I'll focus on one dog and then quickly change the focus to the other dog in case I need to do a head swap. In case for some reason one of the dogs is blurry, I'll have multiple photos with a sharp shot of each dog that I can do a head swap in. Anyway, that's a whole other topic. So yeah, f4 for this one. My minimum shutter speed that I use for portraits, and the ISO, whatever it needed to be to correctly expose the photo. So to get that light meter with the little marker in the middle. Okay, so photographing multiple subjects, so groups, so people and dogs. Again, try your hardest to get your subjects lined up on the same plane, because that means you can focus on one, and if the others are in the same plane, they'll be in focus too. That's ideal. It means you can shoot with a shallow depth of field and get you a nice blurry background, and all your subjects will be in focus. So the way I did that here is I got them to sit on the log. So the humans were obviously lined up nicely, and then the dog was also on that same plane. So I didn't do any head swaps with this. And I shot at f4 just to be sure. So I increased my depth of field. So I made the hole in the lens a bit smaller. Gives me more depth of field, higher number. And that gave me this result where all the subjects, even though there's multiple subjects here, they're all in the same plane, they're all nicely in focus. 1/800th of a second just to allow for any movement. Great Dane puppy, a little bit more random than an adult Great Dane, so you want to keep that shutter speed up a bit higher. And again, the ISO, whatever it needed to be. This was a family group. This lovely husky, she was unable to walk, so we did a lot of shots with her kind of just lying down, and her family members gathered around her. It's a really lovely session. So this was kind of towards the end of the day. The sun was very, very low in the sky in behind, kind of over to the right a little bit. So there wasn't a heap of light, but they're in a nice big open area, so there was kind of enough light there. I chose f5 because I didn't really want to have to do a head swap with this, because it would be a bit tricky because they're all quite clustered close together, and doing head swaps when you've got heads overlapping and things is a bit harder. So I made the decision to increase that depth of field to f5. But because the size of the hole in the lens was smaller, it wasn't letting in as much light, I couldn't go too high with the shutter speed. I was still fast enough with the shutter speed so that if there was a bit of movement, I would be able to freeze it. And then the ISO had to be 1000 to be able to properly expose the image. Okay. And then last image. So again, this was another, this was a bit of a random candid sort of shot. It was really cute. This was an Aussie Shepherd and a Border Collie, my two absolute favorite dog breeds in the world. So I basically, it's kind of like a candid portrait shot where I picked a nice spot for them to sit, got them to sit over there, and just basically told them to interact. So getting them to try and line up all perfectly on the same plane in this instant would have kind of ruined the spontaneity of the shot. So to allow for the fact that everyone wasn't lined up perfectly, I chose F5, just to give a nice slightly deeper depth of field, so that all the subjects would be in focus, even if they weren't lined up perfectly. So that's why I chose F5 for this shot. There was a bit of movement, as you can see. They were kind of playing with the dogs. That would have been quite funny. So I chose 1/800th of a second, and ISO 1000, because that's what the ISO needed to be to properly expose the shot. While it looks like they're amongst trees, the trees were kind of in the background, and they were sort of under open sky. So it was open sky above with the direct sunlight coming from behind. So that's my backlighting kind of technique that I use. So that's the end of the example images. I'm really hoping that they were useful for you guys and gave you some practical real life examples of why I have chosen particular settings in certain situations. So in conclusion, tips for success. So just a few things to keep in mind. These are the takeaways that I want you to sort of take away from this whole session. So especially when you're first starting out shooting manual, just keep your aperture wide open. So the smallest number, f2.8, perfect. Just keep it on there. If you're shooting groups, or if you want more of the background in focus, you definitely need to increase that. But when you're just starting out, you're photographing a single subject, just keep it wide open. You'll end up with a shallow depth of field, which looks really cool. And it also forces you to be really accurate with your focusing as well, which is good. But just keep it wide open. Smallest number that your lens is capable of. Keep your minimum shutter speeds in mind. Nice and easy. Portraits, 1/500th of a second. Don't go any slower. Action, 1/1000th of a second. Don't go any slower. If you're shooting a portrait of a dog that's shifting around a lot, take it higher than 1/500th of a second. If you're shooting crazy action with water flying everywhere, take it higher than 1/1000th of a second. These are your minimums. Nice and easy to remember. And then your ISO, being your utility element, you can just change that to be whatever it needs to be to get you the right exposure. And then remember, this is the hardest thing to remember sometimes when you're out shooting, is every time you move locations or if the light changes, check your exposure. Take a test shot. If you're shooting with the sun behind you and you're shooting your subject and your subject is receiving full sun, that's really bright light. If you then wander over here and shoot in the other direction and the subject is then in shade, that's less light. So you need to adjust your settings. You need to change your settings. Take a test shot, have a look on the back of your camera, have a look at your blinkies, see if there's any blinkies, have a look at your histogram. Remember, you want to get all your tones nicely included on that little graph. If you get into the habit of always checking your exposure whenever you change your situation, that it forces you to shoot more deliberately and make decisions about the sorts of shots that you're taking and put a little bit more care and attention into what you're doing. It forces you to do that. And it also means that you're not going to end up with blurry photos. You're not going to end up with poor quality photos. You're going to end up with consistent photos when it comes to editing. So many reasons to do it this way, to shoot manual. So I want to give you guys a challenge. I know Nicole's given you lots of challenges, and this is only if you choose to accept it. Your challenge, if you choose to accept it, I want you to put your camera on manual exposure mode. I want you to go take a photo, preferably of a pet, because this is a pet photography group. We're all into pets. But it can be anything. If you don't have one handy or it's not possible, that's fine. It can just be a scene. It can be, I think Nicole's been getting you to use stuffed toys, coffee cups, whatever you've got. Just go take a photo of something using your new knowledge about how to set the exposure. Now, this slideshow that I've been doing is going to be available for you guys to download as a PDF, so you'll be able to refer to it. Really good way to have it on your camera when you're shooting is to just take a photo of your computer screen. with your camera. So you can be looking through the photos on the back of your camera and you actually see a picture of, say, something that's going to be handy to you. Like, for example, this, or the step-by-step how to determine exposure manual. This might be a good thing to have handy while you're doing this challenge. And then I want you to post your photo in the group. Feel free to tag me, Charlotte Reeves, in the group if you want me to see it. And I want you to tell us what aperture, shutter speed, and ISO you chose for that image and why. Why did you choose those settings? So, looking forward to seeing everyone's images. If you would like to see more of my education stuff, just head to learnpetphotography.com. Also, a reminder that I am in Nicole's Hair of the Dog Academy. I do a monthly critique corner, and I'm always hanging out in the private Facebook group to give help and advice to people in the group who are part of the academy. I'm also in Nicole's Elevate program. So if any of you are in there, hi, thanks for joining me. And in general, I need to wrap this up because this has gone for nearly 2 hours, which is ridiculous. And thank you so much for sticking it out. And I'm really hoping that has explained what is a very tricky concept to grasp in terms of photography when it comes to photography. I'm really hoping that there were some light bulb moments today. So I'm just going to look at the comments real quick. Okay, awesome. I'm glad this has been helpful for you guys. It's really, really good to see all the comments coming through. Good stuff. Thanks for sticking it out. Awesome. Oh, we'll do one more. We'll do one more little goodbye from a certain little special furry someone. Little Enzo wanted to say goodbye. He's very sleepy. It's really hard being a puppy. Oh, he's so gorgeous. It's nice when he's sleepy. He's not so spiky with his teeth. Awesome. Okay, guys. Enzo's waving goodbye. Oh, sorry, buddy. He doesn't want to wave. Here we go. Enzo's waving goodbye. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone. See you soon in the group. Looking forward to seeing your images.